Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone here to the special meeting of the Board of Estimates. Before we get into today's proceedings, I would like to first publicly talk about some events that took place last night here at City Hall. We had a chance as a council to hear a bill that has been talked about for quite some time, since November. How can the city develop ways to dispose of property in a different way that we've done so in the past? And that's ensuring that we prioritize Baltimore City residents first. And because of that, we had a tremendous outpouring of Baltimore City residents, some for, a lot for, some against. But unfortunately, there were the actions of some that was completely disrespectful to the institution of the city council, to this historic building, and to the overwhelming amount of citizens who were here to participate and be civically engaged in their government. And as the leader of that institution, it is my responsibility to ensure that that never takes place again. So I think that it's really important that we understand and know that that was an embarrassment to this building, and we will take the corrective steps in working with the mayor's team, the police department, DGS, and whomever to ensure that an individual or a small group of individuals do not have the ability to disrupt City Hall, city operations like that. To the men and women who work in this building, to the police officers who was helping to secure the building, I sincerely apologize. And again, it's completely unacceptable, and we look forward to moving forward. Now, it's important that we don't allow those actions to take away the substance of what we're talking about, and it's ensuring that we are providing real opportunities for Baltimore City residents. We will continue to have that, and whether there's ideological differences, the idea that those differences can't be done in a way of productivity is, again, unacceptable. To the unfounded claims, the unfounded words that one individual spout as it relates to the mayor of the city of Baltimore, as well as to a council member. Again, that is completely unacceptable. And on the record, we reflected that yesterday. So with that, we're going to go into today's proceedings. The purpose of this meeting, again, we're all here, is to receive a briefing from the Department of Finance and BBMR on the proposed budget of fiscal year 2023. The BOE is meeting in a hybrid format, and I would ask that those present here in BOE boardroom, please wear your mask and silence your cell phone and other electronic devices. If you're joining via WebEx, please ensure you keep yourself muted. In the interest of keeping this meeting to the allotted time, I will turn it directly over to Director of Department of Finance, Mr. Henry Raymond, as well as to the Budget Director, Mr. Bob Sinemy. Gentlemen, at this point, I yield the floor and the mic to you.
Hi, thank you, and good morning. So we have two special sessions of the board today. So the first one here is for BBMR to give a briefing on the fiscal 2023 budget. Reminder that we also have a second special session of the Board of Estimates tonight at 6 p.m., which we call Taxpayers Night, which is an opportunity for our residents to come in and comment on the proposed fiscal 2023 budget. So for our briefing today, I'll be just doing an overview, a high-level overview of the fiscal 23 budget. This is directed to the board. We'll pause afterwards if there's any further questions. We also have agency heads present on the line as well, if there's any specific questions for agency heads. But I'll do most of the talking, and I'll try to direct my comments to the board and also glance at the slideshow that we have on the screen over here. So without further ado, let's get into it. So our agenda for today is there are four things. First, we'll give an overview, a high-level overview of the 23 budget. Next, we'll go into more detail on the general fund outlook on both the revenue side and fixed cost side. Then we'll get into specific budget recommendations by pillar, and then we'll wrap up talking about other funding sources outside of the general fund. So in terms of the overview of the budget, there was really three themes that we were thinking about as we built the 23 budget. One was, what will this COVID or post-COVID economy look like going into fiscal 23? And I think our answer to that is that it's strong. We've seen a good bounce back from the disruption we had in fiscal 21, and the national economy is pretty strong too, which is helping our local revenues. The second key question we had was how will we pay for Kerwin, the first year of Kerwin contributions? And we have an answer to that at this point, a combination of growing revenues and also a new EMS reimbursement revenue source, which we'll talk about later, has helped us to meet that first year requirement. And then third question was, what will federal aid look like going into fiscal 23? And the answer to that is that we're shifting away from CARES Act funds and FEMA support that we've been using in fiscal 2021 and 22, and starting now to focus more on these bigger strategic investments that we can make with ARPA funds. In terms of highlights of the budget, like I said, we have a new revenue source via EMS reimbursement that will help us invest both directly in EMS services and to do some work on fire facilities, capital investments. We're making the last year investment in our ERP program, ERP project, I should say, the Enterprise Resource Project. We're opening a new rec center in Cherry Hill, the first mega or super rec center that we have, which we're adding operating costs for. We're adding some investments to both Monzi and police to help support the group violence reduction strategy. And then there's a whole host of other enhancements sprinkled throughout the budget, which we'll mention as we go through further today. In terms of COVID federal aid, so I wanted to clarify what is in and not in the 23 budget. So CARES Act is over. There are no CARES Act funds in the fiscal 23 budget. Those funds were due to be spent and were spent by last December. There is no FEMA funding in the 23 budget. The reason for that is that we can't rely on this funding anymore. The federal government has told us that they're starting to scale back their support for some of the things that we've been using FEMA for, largely the hotel sheltering program and our feeding programs and some of the health response as well. So there's no FEMA funds. We'll continue to apply for reimbursement as long as it's there, but we're starting to shift our strategy away to figure out how can we support some of those activities on our own going forward. And then finally, the ARPA Recovery Act funds. There are no new ARPA dollars in the fiscal 23 budget. We appropriated all of the ARPA funds last year when we were awarded them, and we're carrying forward the unspent balance every year until we spend those funds down. So there's no new ARPA dollars in fiscal 23. We will mention ARPA a little bit today, where it really dovetails with some of the operating budget investments that we're making. So, and also for your reference, we've announced already some of the awards of Recovery Act monies, and we have them listed here in the amounts. Over $400 million has already been committed, and we're listing those there. And again, some of these are familiar to you. Broadband equity, Rec and Parks Capital, violence intervention programs have been awarded ARPA funds. So we won't go through all the details of those today, but just for your reference, that's the number of awards we've made so far to date. So in terms of the actual fiscal 23 budget, the operating plan is $3.2 billion. That's a decrease of over $500 million from fiscal 22. Reason for that, again, is we appropriated all of the ARPA funds in the operating budget in 22. That all comes out in 23. Capital investment, $742 million. We'll go back to that later today in a little bit more detail. General fund only at the bottom, $2.135 billion is the investment for the general fund, a little over 9,400 positions. The change from year to year in the general fund is actually 2.8% on a recurring basis. So this says 6%, but there are some one-time items both in the fiscal 22 budget and the 23 budget because of the federal aid. If you look on a recurring revenue to recurring revenue basis, it's 2.8%. So next, this slide is just the math of how we got from the fiscal 22 budget to the 23 budget in the general fund. And you'll notice at the bottom of both sides, both the revenue and expenditure side, we took out that CARES and FEMA money that was supporting the general fund at large, because that is no longer available to us. So that was an adjustment on both sides of the budget. On the revenue side, you'll see we had pretty strong growth on all of our key revenue sources, which we'll come back to in a bit more detail in a moment. On the expenditure side, you can see we had some cost pressure on salaries and benefits, on new education costs that we mentioned is required for fiscal 23, general inflation as an example. What we are showing also on the expenditure side is we're bringing in 40 million new dollars on a recurring basis. That's reimbursement for EMS transports. Now, the way that is working is we are entering into a state program called the Emergency Services Payment Program, which allows us to get reimbursed for Medicaid eligible transport starting in fiscal 22 and into fiscal 23. So that's a new revenue source. Because it's defraying our existing general fund costs, we were able to count it as a savings in the general fund. And we are choosing to invest 5 million of that directly back into EMS services. There will be some one-time funds that we'll be putting towards fire capital investments. And then we also have some more enhancements sprinkled throughout the budget, totaling 13.1 that we'll touch on momentarily. So in terms of general fund revenues, the makeup of our general fund budget really hasn't changed much from last year. There are no new taxes or fees in this budget. About 50% of our revenue still comes from property tax, about 20 from income, and the remaining 30 from a variety of sources, those smaller pieces of the pie there. Our main revenue source, real property tax. This year, the 23 budget includes reassessments for Group 1. Group 1 is the northern third of the city, roughly, and they're a little sliver of the central business district. There's 6.6% assessment growth, triennial growth when the Group 1 properties were reassessed. Now, what we found was we did really well on the residential side, but we did take a hit on the commercial side. And on the next slide, we'll show you that we actually lost commercial value this year. And again, the reason for that is a lot of downtown commercial properties lost value in this latest round of assessments. I think for, pretty obvious reasons, retail establishments, office space, hotels, really struggled during the pandemic and are still struggling. So we did lose some property value on the commercial side. The good news is the residential side grew, we experienced very strong growth, stronger than even we had anticipated. So on a net basis, the growth on the residential assessments is helping to offset some of the losses on the commercial property side. And as you'll see on the next slide, that means that we will continue to see our property tax revenues grow in fiscal 2023, which is the 10th consecutive year we've seen real property tax growth in Baltimore. On income tax, I'm sorry, one more thing on property tax. We have the same tax rate this year, $2.248 per $100 of assessed value. I wanted to mention that we are still maintaining what we call the targeted homeowners tax credit. Some people remember this is the 20 cents by 2020 program where we aim to chip away at the tax rate for residential owner-occupied property owners over the course of the last decade. I mention this here because we are continuing this program at the same level. So this is a savings for taxpayers every year of about $350 on their tax bill every year for the average residential homeowner in the city. So we met the goal, but it's important to mention that we are continuing that program, and it is a savings every year for our taxpayers. On income tax has been a pleasant surprise for us during COVID. We really have not seen an impact to income tax because of the pandemic. We're projecting continual growth into fiscal 23. One thing to note here is that we are seeing some evidence when we dive into the tax return data that we get on a more global grouped basis from the state. There were 1,400 more taxpayers that filed taxes in the city in calendar 20 tax year versus calendar 2019. So that, I think, is a signal that we might be kind of strengthening to our tax base, even though we're have been losing population overall. Having more folks working and earning income in the city is a good sign for our revenues. Moving ahead to tourism and visitor revenues. These are the revenues: parking plus hotel, plus convention center, plus admissions and amusement. These are the ones that got really crushed during the pandemic. You can see in fiscal 21, we lost about half of the value of these sources in just 1 year. They've rebounded pretty nicely, though, and in fiscal 23, we're expecting them to be at about 85% of the pre-pandemic level, which is, a quicker recovery than we were anticipating. So good news mostly on that front. Next slide, recordation and transfer taxes. Also a really good story for us. You can see here that light blue or green bar on the far right, fiscal 22, we're estimating that we'll receive $130 million of transfer and recordation receipts in fiscal 22. Would be the highest we've ever recorded. The housing market, again, on the residential side has been really hot, and that has led to, more transactions and more receipts in this source. Our budget for 2023 for this source is only about $90 million. And the reason for that is we don't want to over rely on this because the market can be, cyclical and can change very quickly. And there's already evidence that the market will cool off a bit. We have, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. We have, which inevitably will lead to higher mortgage rates, which will, I think slow down the activity in the housing market a little bit. But in the meantime, you're kind of riding this wave, and we're going to devote some of those extra resources in 22 to capital projects, which we'll show you a little bit later. And then highway user revenue, projecting $170 million for fiscal 23. We take our guidance on this from the state, from MDOT. They do an analysis of, vehicle-related activity, things like registration fees, titling fees, gas tax revenues, and they share that back with local jurisdictions. So we're expecting to see continued growth in 23. The big news is that in the state session, we got part of our allocation restored, the piece that had been cut. And on the next slide, if you look at the history of HUR, as I've told folks many times, and we really got hit hard in the last recession, going back to over 15 years ago now. And the bill that passed this session is going to partially restore revenues for the city from fiscal 24 to 28. So that won't affect this year's budget, but looking ahead at the next 5 years, we'll have an opportunity to make some significant capital investments, especially on the transportation side, which is where, we believe they're most desperately needed. And then traffic camera revenues. This is the general fund program, the cameras that are around school buildings. We're projecting about $900,000 of growth from 22 to 23. We're continuing to add cameras where we find new locations that, need some help on the safety side. But we are issuing fewer citations per camera, and that's expected. Any one of these programs, as the behavior changes, we should be bringing in less revenue. So the net of those two things, adding more cameras and seeing slightly fewer citations per camera, is bumping up the forecast by about $900,000. We will talk about the I-83 cameras separate. That's a separate program with a separate required location for the spending to go. So we'll come back to that in a moment. And that's it for the revenue side. So moving to fixed costs on the expenditure side. So our fixed cost, the green line here that you see in the middle is the fixed cost as a percent of general fund revenues. We like to look at this because the higher that line is, the more it's crowding out, spending on other things that we would like to spend money on. The reason for the increase this year is the first year of Kerwin. So that is a fixed cost. It's something that we wanted to support, obviously, for schools, but it is a mandated state cost, so it's included here. So that's what's bumping the green line up in 23. And on Kerwin specifically, on the next slide, there's a chart showing our expected growth over the next 10 years at the top. I show that versus a longer history at the bottom, just to mention that our contributions to schools have grown over the last decade or so, but after this big first year increase, we still have a higher slope on the growth for cost over the next decade. So we're very excited that we've been able to meet the first year requirement for Kerwin, but the work, of course, is not done. This will be a continual challenge for the city to make sure we make smart choices so that we can meet those requirements. Next, on pension, we'll be contributing $12 million less into our pension funds in fiscal 23 versus fiscal 22. And the reason for that is that we had extraordinary investment returns in fiscal 21 in both of the pension systems, both F&P and ERS. over 25% performance, investment performance in both funds. Some of that was good management. Some of it was just us riding, a pretty hot market during that time. And when you have an extraordinary year of returns like that, it does reduce sometimes your contributions for the next fiscal year. That's like a once per decade type trend, maybe twice per decade. So it's not something that we can rely on, but it did help us for fiscal 23 that we'll be contributing less into those funds. Again, that doesn't mean we're under contributing. It's still the amount that's actuarially required for fiscal 23. On inflation, this is something we haven't talked about much over my career here because inflation has usually been, anywhere from 1% to 3%. We make a small adjustment in the budget and we don't talk about it much, but now that it's present, it's important to explain. We're assuming 4.6% inflation in fiscal 23. Now, you're probably reading some of the news where people are talking about 8% and higher inflation right now. We do think from looking at the forecast that will come down some in fiscal 23, but we did decide to build in a higher level inflation than usual because, again, we need to make sure our agencies that are delivering services have the funds they need to just, purchase supplies and materials and contracts, all of which we're seeing cost pressure up because of that. We will likely see we'll probably have some pressure on wages too, for sure, with this level of inflation going forward. So those are the fixed cost side of the expenditure budget. Again, things that are kind of set in stone that we don't have a ton of influence over. What I want to run through quickly now are the actual recommendations by pillar in the budget this year and focusing again mostly on new investments in this part of the section. So first thing, we built our budget around the mayor's action plan. So, as of the end of last year, we have a published action plan that's very clear on, each of the 5 pillars that the mayor's laid out and the goals that we want to achieve as a city. So we relaunched what we call our outcome-based budgeting process for fiscal 23. And basically what that means is we look at the strategic plan, we try to budget around it, right? We try to make investments that can make a difference in some of those specific goals in the action plan. So, very proud to report that we convened broader teams to work on the budget. This team, we call them results teams. We had city employees on those teams. We had community members on those teams as well to help us, pick through all of the budget options and make sure we're investing in the things that are aligned with the mayor's action plan. And starting with prioritizing youth, we'll go through each pillar quickly with some highlights. Prioritizing youth, again, we're meeting that first year requirement for city schools, for Kerwin, and we're also in this year's budget adding $1.2 million of operating costs to support this new Cherry Hill Fitness and Wellness Center. That's on top, of course, of the ARPA funds that have already been allocated, $41 million to do some improvements to a variety of rec and parks facilities. On the public safety side, I mentioned earlier, we're entering this new program to get reimbursement for Medicaid reimbursement for transports for Medicaid eligible patients. And so we decided to invest some of that new revenue directly back into EMS. This is one area of the mayor's action plan that, we acknowledge needs some improvement. And so there's 4 things we're doing. We're adding 2 BLS units into service. We're adding some medical quality assurance staff on each shift to make sure we're delivering the right medical care. And we're also going to pilot 2, what I would call diversion programs, ways to try to take pressure off of our EMS system, which is extraordinarily busy, and make sure we focus on, delivering the right service to the most urgent emergencies. So one of those is what we call a population health initiative. It's basically us trying to create connections between our EMS service and local medical institutions, and especially urgent care and even primary care physicians, so that we don't have to drop everybody off at the emergency room. That causes backups and problems and delays in the system when we drop off people that, have minor, issues and take them to the ER. We're also piloting a program we call the 911 nurse triage program, which would put someone in the call center to listen for calls that are truly, low emergency, low acuity type calls. And, fire department estimates that anywhere from 5 to 10,000 911 calls we get each year are truly for very, very limited issues that don't require an immediate response. So if we can triage those and either provide the service over the phone or send a smaller unit, not even a medic unit, even a car potentially, to respond to those, we take the pressure off of our EMS units, which are, like I said, extraordinarily busy. Next on public safety, we are, we've already made this investment in the group violence reduction strategy in Monzi. We are supporting that with 9 additional positions in BPD to make sure that they can implement the strategy that Monzi is leading. And then we also are adding civilian positions to assist with investigation. So we're looking for creative ways to take the pressure off of our sworn personnel. It's a struggle to hire, those personnel now, not just here, but all throughout the country. And so we're going to try something where we have civilians assist lead detectives on investigative cases. And so we found that from looking at other police departments, civilians can do, they can interview witnesses, they can do research, they can track down leads and look for hits in databases for certain things. So they can assist on those cases. They won't be the lead, but the more we can use civilians to assist, it'll take more pressure again off of our sworn folks who are desperately needed to be doing patrol and lead investigations, especially. Public safety as well. This is the first year of the latest contract with FOP. It was signed during 2021, but fiscal 23 is the first full year. And just a reminder that contract includes higher salaries for entry-level police officers to get us at parity and get us competitive for new hires, and also some incentive pay for things like patrol work and education as well. And then coming back to the traffic cameras, the I-83 traffic cameras. So I-83 traffic cameras are in a separate special fund in our budget because the state law requires those revenues to first pay for administrative costs and then be put back towards improvements on I-83. So, we've made an estimate of about $35 million for first year revenues. It's a very rough estimate. We talked to this with DOT many times. It's really hard to predict what the behavior change will be in that first year, but we do know that there's pretty heavy volume on the highway. We have some studies that we've done in the past that show how many people are speeding at any given time. So working off that data, we've made an estimate of the first year revenue. But again, only the net proceeds, which we estimate to be about $20 million, would go towards I-83 improvements. If it's more, it goes to those improvements. If it's less, it goes to those improvements. So none of this affects the general fund. We're not relying on this program to fund, general fund services. Moving to clean and healthy, just a reminder that we still will be doing direct COVID-19 response, vaccinations, vaccination education efforts, contact tracing, testing. The funding source for that, though, is shifting to ARPA. So we were paying for a lot of that out of CARES Act money and out of FEMA funds, but that will shift to Recovery Act money. They were awarded $80 million award over the next 3.5 years to continue the response. So that work will still be going on, just a shift in source. And then we wanted to mention another ARPA-funded program. This is not new in the 23 budget, but it will be funded out of ARPA, which is the Clean Core program. The idea being get our agencies to put our residents to work, helping keep their neighborhoods clean, which we're very excited about that new initiative. Next, under equitable neighborhood development, so we will have there will be enhancements in the housing department to try to start to tackle this vacant housing issue we have. There's also an enhancement in Live Baltimore to develop an ad campaign to target home buyers. We think that there are folks in the Baltimore DC region that we could target to make homeowners in Baltimore City. So we're putting some funds towards that. And then also in equitable neighborhood development, 2 ARPA funded programs. Again, these 2 are not new in the 23 budget, but there's the Buy Back the Block program that Live Baltimore will be putting in place, and then a wealth building initiative for our middle neighborhoods. Again, both of these are ARPA investments that kind of dovetail with a lot of things we're trying to do to improve our conditions in the city and improve our tax base, of course. Finally, on equitable development, we're putting some more resources towards the MWBE program to make sure we're complying with requirements on contracts. And we're also putting some resources directly on the equity law, which was passed in 2018, of course, to make sure that we're complying with the letter and spirit of that law. And then finally, on our final pillar, stewardship of city resources, we'll be doing the final phase of ERP investment this year for that project. And then we are adding some positions, 5 positions in BSIT to improve our cybersecurity. What we found is that there's just a maze of software patches that becomes available on any given day, and we need to keep up with those to make sure we've got the latest stuff available so that we can protect our systems, of course, coming out of the ransomware attack that we saw a few years ago here. And then also in stewardship, we're going to make a small investment in DGS to better track our energy, which we think is especially important given that buildings are kind of partially occupied in a lot of places. We think we have some savings there by managing better on a floor-by-floor basis. And we're also putting in place some improvements to CUB salaries, specific classifications that we found were at 90% or below the market rate. So we're thinking that the money there will go to improve our recruitment and hopefully our retention as well. There's a bunch of other enhancements kind of scattered throughout the budget. I'll mention them quickly. Reopening the visitor center in the Inner Harbor. There's point of sale software funded for our public markets to assist vendors there. There's a resource in planning to look at options for improving our response to extreme weather events. There's a fire apprenticeship program, which will fund high school students, internships in the hopes of getting them to join the fire department directly out of high school. And in DOT, we have the first investment, $3 million, to do compliance with our ADA lawsuit that's outstanding. We also got $10 million in the state budget, we just learned last week, for that. And also some investment in DOT to match what we think will be additional formula dollars available from the infrastructure bill that passed in Congress this year. So in terms of other fund sources, to wrap up, first on the capital budget side. So we said before, increase of $742 million versus last year. What you see a lot of times in the capital budget is there is a cycle to it. We go out in kind of waves for, especially on revenue bonds on the water and wastewater side. So you see a higher amount for revenue bonds this year. I did want to zero in on that improvement in general fund PAYGO this year. So we went from $15 million last year to over 90 this year. And the reason for that is we're using one-time resources that are available. We showed you earlier that 22 has been a pretty good year for the city. We're trying to make those funds available directly for capital investment. So when we have a good year, we have more proceeds. Our policy has been to put that towards capital investment where we really need those dollars. And on the next slide, we'll show you a little bit, what we're doing with that. A lot of it will go towards public safety. So between the new EMS revenue program and some of the surplus we've seen in fiscal 22, we're putting that towards fire facilities, especially number one, and also potentially some police facility investments, which are, again, a dire need in the city for those. We also got some money in the state budget there. Some good news that there's 10 for fire and 10 for police that will go towards public safety facilities. And then what that means historically is this is a strong year for capital investment. But, just note that yellow portion, those are one-time resources. So, I don't anticipate we'll be able to repeat this every year. But again, when we have a strong year on the revenue side, our instinct is to put it right back into capital investment as soon as we possibly can, which we're doing. And then other fund sources, grants. So the preliminary budget, I'm listing here some of the grants we get on a pretty consistent basis, things like CDBG, Ryan White funds, circulator support from the state. We get some support for library hours from the state. These are the grants that are, pretty consistent from year to year. The preliminary budget that we released does not yet have the results of the final state budget, which we got a lot of good news, over the last couple of weeks. That will be in the final budget that comes to the Board of Estimates in May. So our staff is actually working to go back into the system and add, in many cases, a lot of good news where we have additional funding. Most of it is actually on the capital budget side. And then finally, the utility funds. The actual dollar amount from 22 to 23, it's lower. There was a big chunk of debt service that comes off in fiscal 23. So this is not a reduction in service. And as has been announced already, the rate increase for next year, there still will be a rate increase, but much lower than what we've gotten used to here. So somewhere in the 3% range for for water and wastewater for fiscal 2023. So that is the 23 budget in about a short amount of time. I think I can squeeze it in, and happy to take any questions from board members.
Thank you, Director Sinemi. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then we're going to circle back to see if there's other questions. And
Sure.
it's probably going to be just mainly between me and the comptroller.
We assume the mayor already asked all that.
Yeah.
Yes, you did.
I guess, looking at like it from an inflation perspective, I know it's approaching like 9% now. And I know you talked about the fact that you expected to see it around like 4.6% next year.
Right.
That's still like a 2x increase from what we're kind of used to, I guess, 2 years ago.
Right.
When we talk about like knowing that where we are with record level short staffing of city agencies and just sometimes the lack of competitive nature of like where we are in the region, not just as it relates to other municipalities, but also the federal government and the private sector.
Right.
What do we really do? How are we going to approach this budget as it relates to, providing that cushion to ensure that we are retaining particularly the critical employees that we need, knowing the short staff that we are currently under?
Yeah, we have been thinking about that. It is, we have noticed that slowly over time, especially in the last year or two, we have seen just a slight kind of uptick in the number of vacant positions we have. So this is a challenge in some of our agencies. I think there's a couple of things we're doing. One is, we're doing targeted improvements like we showed for CUB positions. So we do, our HR department does kind of a cycle of salary studies each year, and try to identify, rather than giving kind of across the board raises sometimes, we look for the actual classifications and compare them to other jurisdictions and see where we're short. So the one we're due for funding this year, we found that a couple things that happened. One was that some of the increases we had done in prior years for AFSCME employees led to some compression where their supervisors, it was kind of like too narrow of a gap. So somebody was working on a crew, they say, why should I be a supervisor if I'm only going to make a couple thousand more dollars? So part of it was, making sure that there's that distance. So we encourage, career progression. There were also just some positions, and we listed them there, some of our office assistant type positions, administrative positions, inspector positions, that when we compared them, they were just lower. And again, we're not going to be able to match other jurisdictions at all points because we're collectively a less wealthy tax base we have here, but where we can be smart, we can target some dollars and say, let's get the ones that are kind of out of range with other jurisdictions and add some funding, particularly there. We did the same thing on the police contract as well, where rather than giving just across the board increases in 23, we said, let's actually target the money at the earlier stage of the scale, which is where we're having trouble in recruitment, and just at least being able to match, what a Baltimore County or Anne Arundel or other neighboring jurisdictions can offer. So, we're where we can afford it, where we can afford it, we try to do that. We try to do it on a smart kind of targeted basis is what I would say.
Thank you for that. I think the mayor wants to follow up.
Just really quickly, Mr. President, on that point, Bob, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but the starting salary is now at 60,000, which it was at, I think, 55 or 57 a few years ago.
Yeah, and when we were negotiating the contract, I think we actually did compare with the other jurisdictions. I don't know if there's been changes since then, but we were right at either at or above for at least those entry level positions for police officers, which we think should help the efforts.
And I know you talked about in your presentation putting in the education benefits. This was something that was cut in previous years because of budgetary things, correct?
Yeah, so the contract has educational incentives. So if you have, bachelor's or master's or advanced degree, you actually get additional pay as a police officer. When we were negotiating the contract, higher levels of education, should lead. We've seen some evidence that does lead to a better police officer. So we want to be incenting our officers to get those incentives where they're available.
Now, I noticed on the same point that I think BBR notes a 1% increase amounts to about $10 million.
Right.
When you extrapolate that across the city, 1% really doesn't really put a dent in an employee as it relates to like their purchasing power, for instance.
Right.
Is there a way to do that targeted focus, particularly on our employees that make less, knowing that their purchasing power will be further exacerbated with the conditions associated with inflation. Is that a strategy that's being employed? Because that $10 million focusing on those types of employees could go a long way potentially as it relates to them, dealing with the immediacy of inflation.
Right. Yeah. I think our approach is, again, trying to be targeted. So that is an approach that we'll look at with other unions to look, are there certain classifications that are not competitive? Because you're right, 1% doesn't mean much, but for the city as a whole, that's a lot of money.
Correct.
We do have cost of living, raises built in across all unions for this year. We're still negotiating with some of those unions, but I think our approach is going to have to be target some of the dollars as best we can, because, this inflation pinch, we recognize that it's putting pressure on employees, for their families, but it is putting pressure on the city too, right? It's just becoming more expensive to provide services. So our approach is to try to target it as best we can to the areas of specific need where our classes are just out of line with the benchmarks in the region.
Yeah, I'm just really concerned with the trend of retention. It's
Yeah.
not just a Baltimore City issue, it's happening globally, actually. And not just in public sector, but also in private sector. And there's a tremendous amount of opportunity out there for folks to get gainful employment in other sectors. So,
Yeah.
many folks that are keeping the city running on a daily basis, just really trying to figure out if there's a way for us to target those individuals and ensure that we're doing the best thing that we can do to try to retain them.
Yeah, we're definitely thinking about that, and we'll continue to focus on that for sure.
And like I said, we're probably going to go back and forth. I'm not going to get all my questions out. The next question I'll go to is when we talk about the innovation fund. I saw that was eliminated from this budget. Now, historically, that's been an avenue to identify cost savings or also identify ways to develop new revenue generating types of programs.
Right.
And it seemed to be like really successful when you read over the budget books of the past.
Yep.
Successful as it relates to what the program was able to identify, and then ultimately the end result or return on investment that we were able to receive.
Right.
Many of the loans being repaid back, and then many of the revenue generated, 2, 3, 4, 5x of what was initially put in. What was the strategy from the administration to cut that out of this budget?
Yeah, so we're not cutting the program out. We're just not showing any new loans in the budget this year. We do take applications for that on a rolling basis. So, if we provide a loan and it pays back, it refreshes, recapitalizes the fund. So we do have the discretion, if we have a good idea, to give additional loans out. I think the reason why you don't see any new loans here, to be frank, is that because of the ARPA money we got, there was so much focus of agencies on figuring out how they could apply for ARPA dollars, which are grant dollars essentially, right? That there was less interest.
Who's interested in asking for a loan when they can get a grant?
Yeah, who wants the loan we get? So I do, we have an FTE on our team that generates, that works with our staff and works with agencies to try to generate ideas. If anybody on the board or anybody has an idea on an investment that can save money, we're all ears to that, and we would work with that agency to do that. But we do have funds available, repaid from previous projects, that we could lend out if we get good ideas. And what we do with agencies there is we have just a small MOU between us and the agency that says we will provide you X number of dollars and you would commit to generate these savings over a certain period of time to pay back the loan. So we are still offering the program. It's just we didn't make any loans in the budget for 23.
And I kind of hear the point that Comptroller brought up and you kind of agree, but I still take some concern with that because, innovation doesn't necessarily happen by happenstance. Typically, I think the program was created to really spark ideas and, with this idea of putting the money out there. So I think it would look best to put money in innovation funds so folks know that money is there. This idea that you still can fund projects, but people see it bottomed out at zero. I think it's the wrong direction. I also think it's a slippery slope because the idea is when we're out of ARPA, right, and we're out of this cushy, $641 million, ARPA phase, this idea of innovation needs to continue to grow. And then, when you double down on the fact is this is a public sector and the bureaucracy that surrounds it. And while many of the problems have been kicked down the road and innovation hasn't sparked to move us in a different direction, again, it's just moving us further and further away from that idea. I've been very vocal about even like the camera contract on 83 and how that could have been a strong entrepreneurial avenue and how that could have potentially kind of been fed into from the innovation perspective of where we see 83 going in the future.
Right.
I'll just ask, I'm publicly asking you as well as the mayor to really look back at maybe it's a way outside of the preliminary budget for us to put actual dollars in an innovation fund and really push to our agencies, not as it relates to the immediate needs that fits into the regulations associated with ARPA, but for them to really think outside of the box and really try to drive innovation with city government. And again, I think that we've seen the return on investment in the past. I think it's been wholly successful,
Right.
and it's something that we should continue to do.
Yeah, totally, 100% agreeing with you on that. I was an analyst when we started the Innovation Fund, worked a lot on it, so it's very near and dear to my heart, frankly. And we will, as we shift away from ARPA, as those dollars, go away or we commit those, we'll definitely do kind of some additional, push to agencies. There's agencies on this call right now and reminding them that, yeah, there's a big focus on ARPA this year, but one-time, loans are available where we have ways that we can get more efficient. So
Yeah, and we can't, I guess my point is we can't slow down the push that you guys have already started. We don't want to restart the push after ARPA.
right.
At this point, we're going to go back and forth. I'm turning it over to Comptroller if you have any questions. And anybody else on the board? I'm sorry, we'll go to the mayor first.
No.
You're all right. Ms. Comptroller, the floor is yours.
Okay, does that mean I have to give it back after I ask two questions? Or? I actually, we already did a little internal calling, and I have 5 questions that I want to ask here, and the other questions that we put together, we're just going to email you, and we're going to ask you to send us a written response. But most of the questions are related to looking at previous audits of individual agencies and looking to see whether we have followed up with a budgetary response to those, although 1 or 2 of these were just questions that people asked us and we were like, we don't know, we'll ask Bob. The first one is there was a previous audit for DOT pre-COVID that found that even before COVID, the Charm City Circulator was not running at full capacity. But now that COVID restrictions are loosening and more people are coming back to work in person, we wanted to check in and find out whether or not that was going to affect operating funding for the circulator.
So the operating funding for the circulator is not changed in this year's budget. So we recognize that there was kind of lower capacity during that time, but we still have the same level of funding, which means they can get back to the usual level of service that they have.
Is that a number you know off the top of your head?
Well, it's about 13 million total, which is operations plus, some capital investments that they're doing on a recurring basis. But I can get you the exact number. After the.
There was a performance audit for the BDP that found that they were not meeting their performance target for dispatching priority 1 service calls to officers in less than 60 seconds. Conversations with BPD and with the council oversight have looked at that target and looked at addressing that issue, but most of that conversation has been around trying to increase the number of available patrol officers. What we're curious about is looking at diverting more of those calls to non-law enforcement personnel, such as mental health professionals. We heard you mentioned the civilian investigators, the additional funding in the budget for that. Is there any more funding for the mobile crisis team that BHSB staffs with mental health professionals?
So there was the pilot going on to divert a small number of calls to other professionals, mental health professionals. So there's no new funding on top of that in this year's budget. But I think the plan has been to kind of see how that first, just those limited number of calls, how that works, and look for ways to expand that if we can, add more calls to other, non-uniform response. I would also say on that response, on that performance measure, And that's one that we really think a lot about because it's like, it's your experience as a citizen is like, does somebody show up on time? That's very important to people's impression. And the civilianization effort that we've been talking about, even though it's on the investigation side, all of that frees up sworn resources in general. So we do think that even some of those small investments we're making in civilians will help kind of, again, make more, sworn bodies available for all the functions that need to be done. We also are working with the police department on figuring out how to staff the telephone reporting unit, which is for non-urgent calls. Can you do and get like a report or get, if it's a minor incident, can you do that over the phone rather than send an officer? So we are working with them on that. And there might be something in the final budget to reflect that.
And real quick, I think the mayor would like to chime in real quick on that point.
Yeah, just, Mr. Comptroller, I think that the two of you probably were my first co-sponsors to a long ago city council item around TRU and online reporting, which is all a part of this civilization effort. It's really about having our sworn officers respond to priority ones and not consistently being called to calls that, quite frankly, don't need a lights and siren blaring down the street police response. And through civilizations, through TRU, through online reporting, we are building that capacity to take thousands of those calls that way so that our residents are seeing their patrol officers, quite frankly, not just have the ability to respond to incidents, but to actually patrol and not just be call takers, essentially what they are today.
If I can just do one more and then we can do the.
You can keep going, Mr. Comptroller.
Well, okay. The one of the major concerns in the most recent DPW audit was water revenue collection. Is there more funding in the coming budget, either for DPW or for Finance's Bureau of Revenue Collections, to somehow improve or increase revenue collection methods?
There's none nothing different in this year's budget on that front, I don't believe.
Is there any funding in this budget to address some of the recent disruptions to trash and recycling collection?
No, so we've gotten a lot of questions about this. This is basically a current service budget for DPW, but by that I mean that a lot of the issues there have been staffing issues where there's been people sick and not available to work. So the budget isn't reduced to reflect that we're providing less service. I mean, we anticipating trying to, over time, when we get more stability, to go back to the usual.
Oh, I think, and this one was not one that came from audit. I think the point of this question was, were we adding any additional funding so that it would give DPW the flexibility to address other ways of doing collections when existing staffing was insufficient? Like, is there additional funding for them to pursue other strategies?
There's not in the budget as planned, but we've kind of thought of it as that during this COVID disruption period, ARPA is a possibility if you have to do something on a short-term basis. I mean, we use CARES Act money to help with additional collection, private collection crews to help. So we didn't put any money in the budget for that, but that still is there. That's one of the things I talk about, is that ARPA was meant to cover disruptions of service. So if we are at a point we have to do that, we do have the flexibility to potentially go there. But we didn't put more general fund resources towards it in the fiscal 23 budget.
And then the last question was, we were trying to figure this out. Returns on investment revenues have taken a dip since FY20. This is on page 44 of the preliminary budget. It's gone from $11 million in fiscal 20 to $450,000 in fiscal 22. And, taking into consideration the effect of COVID-19 on the cash balances, it looks like the FY23 estimate is only about 990,000. Can we talk a little bit about why earnings have dropped?
Yeah, so that's really a function of market interest rates. So when you see the historical where we were 8, 10, million and above, kind of market interest rates were higher. Ever since COVID, when Federal Reserve was trying to bring interest rates down to kind of spur spending, we're affected by that because, returns on money market funds or treasury bills and short-term investments are just basically almost nothing.
But that's just the difference.
Yeah, that's the difference. Now, we are looking at that for the final budget because again, the news the last couple of weeks is that the Fed is bumping interest rates up, which means that some of those short-term securities might pay more, which is why there's a small increase projected for fiscal 23. But generally we try to do the best we can with the news that's available, and that could change when we get into the year. So, but yeah, that drop over time is just market interest rates coming down. They were kept low during COVID, and now they're starting to inch back up. Now that inflation is an issue where they're trying to tame that. So that will generate some more earnings, which will help pay for some of the costs we talked
Right.
about, where we've got, more higher costs for a lot of goods and services in our city agencies.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Yep.
President. Thank you, Bob.
Mr. Mayor, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Bob, I'll be quick with my two questions for now. One, it's really for more clarification. Can you, because you talked about the Kerwin and how we're ready for the first year, can you just high level give us, after the direction, what you're doing with all the agencies to think about how we're going to have to deal with Kerwin, not just in this year, but the years to come?
Yeah, sure. So with Kerwin, we've been planning for this for a long time. We've, been, I think, pretty clear with agencies that there were going to need to be trims at some point to kind of meet the first year requirement. And we'll continue to do the same thing as we plan for future years. So, we're taking a critical look at budgets. We've talked about some, for example, vacant positions is one area where we do find occasionally that there's positions that have been vacant long enough where it's just like we don't need them anymore. We've kind of automated our way out of those. And so we're looking at things like that. But we have talked to agencies about this is not just a one-time action to get us through the first year, that there's going to be growth in the out years, that we still need to be, again, more efficient and just very focused on just delivering, the service that we need to do and trying to find savings within agency budget. So that's still on our radar screen and will be for the next, for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. And then the last thing we talked about in the capital, you talked about the specific public safety capital investments. Can you just give a little more detail why those are the focus and some of the restrictions of why those decisions were made?
Yeah, sure. So when we knew that we had this new program available, this EMS revenue, we're actually getting a payment this year for the first year in the program. So it gave us the flexibility to do some one-time investment, on a going basis. We talked about in the 23 budget, how we're using some of that for the general fund and for EMS services, but it gave us the potential option to do some public safety facilities. We convened, the key players in fire and police. I mean, the revenue was coming from this fire action, but we wanted to talk to police as well to figure out what are the facilities that really are in dire need of investment. So our focus was, could we actually rebuild or do some significant renovations in a small number of facilities that are really in dire need, that we're going to be, essentially out of service in the near future anyway. So we brought fire and police together. We also made an ask in the state budget, and we were able to get an additional 10 million focused on two particular firehouses and two particular police district stations in the budget. So getting that additional money from the state does give us the potential to even do more with the dollars that we have in our budget. And so, again, most of those will be capital improvements, either replacing actual stations or making significant renovations to other facilities, which there are dozens of projects that need funding.
City Solicitor, the floor is yours.
Just a couple. On the police capital investments, we've had an issue within the consent decree hearings come up about the firing range and the condition therein. Is there provision in the budget, both operating and capital for that?
So yes, we do have the option for that. The money we got from the state that I mentioned is particularly earmarked for two district stations.
Right.
But with the 40 million coming from this first year of the EMS revenue, we put 25 to fire directly, and there's 15 that we're calling public safety at large. So we haven't decided how we'll use those resources. We want to make sure that, you know, a lot of those go towards fire because that's where the revenue is coming from. But we do have the option of using some of those for other projects on the
The
police
mayor
side.
just pointed out to me that 10 million from the state for the two police stations include the Northeast, which I think is where one of the two firing range is.
Okay.
Is that money then available for that?
It could, yeah, it could be.
Okay. On the EMS reimbursements from Medicaid, I assume, it must be obvious, but I assume that's an ongoing stream of
It is.
revenue that
Yeah.
we can rely on going forward.
Yes.
The highway user revenue was cut, I think it was 2007 or 2008.
Yep.
How does our percentage that we're allotted now compare to what it was at the high water mark before the cut?
So I don't have that by memory. I'd have to go back and look at it. But what we do know is that the increase to the allocations that they gave us gets us over $300 million of additional funds over this 5-year period from fiscal 24 to 28. So I don't remember what the
Yeah,
specific.
your graph
percentage-
kind of shows it looks like it's maybe 85%.
Yeah, the issue is that, we've lost over that time, the cost of doing projects, of
Right.
course, becomes larger. So, our peak was, I think, 227. We're back to 170 or so this year. So, but that's a lot of loss of purchasing power over a time when
Right.
things have gotten more expensive. So, but we do know that this allocation, the percentages that they gave us gets us over 300 million of new investment. And again, that changes based on the whole pot of what's available. So that can change based on, economic conditions, but we think we'll get about 300 million plus. And our instinct would be to throw most, if not all of that towards transportation
transportation.
capital projects,
Great.
because the HUR currently is just covering, essentially just covering our operating budget and a few additional capital expenses.
Right. On the Kerwin, I think our increase in education went up about $65 million. And the total that Baltimore City is investing in K through 12 education is how much?
425 million is in the preliminary budget. The preliminary budget shows an increase of 65 million. I did want to say for the final budget, there was a piece of legislation that gave a little bit of a break to some local jurisdictions on their first contribution for Kerwin. So we're looking at that. There will be a revision in the final budget, but it's still going to be a significant increase.
Would you carry over whatever benefit we get from the state legislation into next year's payment on Kerwin?
Yeah, we're not sure what that does for the long term yet, because partially what it does is it just kind of pushes some of the requirements back. So we're not sure what that will do to 24, 25 and beyond. So we're trying to figure that out now.
That was my next question. That Kerwin was an increase of 65 million this year, but over the next 10 years, the increase continues to go up.
Yeah.
Do you recall what it goes up to?
100 by the last year, it's 155 million annually on top of what we were doing in
Already.
22. So it's another, almost another $100 million of on an annualized basis over that next 8-year period. Or
And
so.
I assume we're doing long-range planning to get us there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
No, thank you, City Solicitor. You good, Director. From a generally accepted accounting principles perspective, why are we still, you're gonna tell me, I don't know the answer to this, but why do we decide to always put our fixed costs in individual agency budgets? Is that something that most municipalities do? I just ask because for the larger agencies, it kind of overinflates their budget, and people don't necessarily extrapolate out that many of its fixed costs that has absolutely nothing to do with the current operations. What's the strategy there?
Yeah, our thinking on that, and we changed this to this method. It goes back about 10 years now. If you actually look at our budgets like pre-fiscal 2013, they're all lower. And the one big thing we do allocate to agencies that fixes the pension
Yeah,
cost.
correct.
And our thinking on that is that, that's a better, I think, representation of the true cost of delivering service. Because if you were to pay a private firm to do some of that, that's kind of built into the price, right? You can't just ignore it. It's part of the cost of doing business. Like we don't get to provide, fire service, for example, without contributing to the pension. So our thinking is that it's part of the fully loaded cost of the service, and we want to try to give our citizens, when they look at the budget, like a true estimate of what it really does to make those costs. So it does, in some cases, it does make the budget look higher for some agencies. In a year like this, when the pension costs are actually coming down, it actually benefits those agencies because it makes them look like a larger, reduction than might have been in another year. But our thinking is you just want to really see the true cost of the service. And that's why we budget things like fleet, for example. We budget vehicles in the police budget or in housing's budget for their inspectors, because you want to see all of the costs that go into delivering the service to be, I think, just more transparent with those.
Is that a general like practice with most municipalities, or is that something unique to?
I can't say it's like an accounting principle. It's more a budgeting philosophy, I would say. It's mixed. Some other counties we've seen do it, some don't. We made that decision a long time to go to that method, and I think it's a better way of doing it. But I can't say that it's every county does it that way. Some do it with the cost budgeted in the service level, and some kind of keep them in another central program.
Yeah, I can certainly understand as it relates to like ongoing city services, but for something like pension, wouldn't just more like a centralized bucket to show all of the city pension at one snapshot?
I mean, we could do that. I mean, we have the numbers.
That's how we always reflect it to the city when we talk about the pressure, the fixed pressure on the city. Why wouldn't we just itemize that out and take it away from? Because again, I just think that it creates a scenario where we have a larger departments, and it overinflates their budget in comparison to maybe a smaller department that is just as important, but doesn't really have that level of pension fixed cost that the police budget has created over the past couple of decades.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. The F&P pension costs are higher than the civilian pension costs for a lot of reasons. So it does have an effect on fire and police especially. But I go back to that's part of the cost of doing business. If we were to reduce pension benefits, we would struggle to retain and recruit officers. So it's part of the cost we see of doing business. It's also, if an agency is being efficient, like we talked about the innovation fund, if an agency is getting more efficient and can find ways to do more with less, or to reduce the number of positions they need, that's also a savings to them that they can show. Not only the salary cost goes away, but the pension costs go away as well. So our thinking is that we don't want to ignore it, because when we become more efficient, it's not just the salary we lose, but we save on those other fixed costs like benefits and pension.
All right. Next, like core city services, so recycling and like street sweeping. Does this budget reflect us going back to full restoration of those services to the city, pre-pandemic?
Yes, and it was never really reduced during that time. It's just at the same level, because we never cut the budget to reflect that we were doing less. Our anticipation was that we were going to try to get back,
Gotcha.
over time to a regular level of service.
So we'll save it for the budget hearings and the agencies. So the idea when we talk to the agencies, wink, wink, we don't have to answer it now, but the idea is that we're going to slowly but surely ramp back up to full restoration, because there is no budgetary issue to do so.
Yeah, there's not a budgetary issue, but definitely would defer to DPW on the timing and what they're looking at. But we didn't make any dramatic changes in this year's budget for that purpose.
Thank you. And then when we talk about fleet management service 189, I saw that increased by like $3 million. The idea is that I think it increased year prior with the expectation that we would see significant wear and tear on many of our vehicles as it relates to COVID response and outreach. Were there any factors that kind of drove that increase this year? Are you going to tell me that pre-pandemic we still needed to increase and we just didn't? We kicked the can down the road and this is what we're doing today?
Yeah, so what's the dynamic there is that we have this borrowing program that we've used. We call it the master lease program, to borrow money to replace a certain number of vehicles each year. That on average, it's been about 25 million we've borrowed each year. And the debt service has been layered in over time. So those have been, and we're now nearing I think it's either the 9th or the 10th year of the program. So what happens is when the first year when we did it, we had the first chunk of debt service, then you layered more, and we'll get to a point when that cost will be fixed. I shouldn't say fixed, but just more level from year to year, because a new round of borrowing will come in and another one will come off, of course. So we're at that point where we're just nearing the peak of what our debt service should be on a long-term basis, which is why.
But wouldn't that be reflected in the agency budget and not in like 189?
Well, in 189, since it's an internal service fund, we show the entire cost of fleet management there, and then they charge each of the agencies for the rental fee. So you do see it.
See, that's confusing based off of the discussion we just had about pension and the other fixed costs.
Yeah, this is for agencies that provide services to other agencies. We have what we call internal service funds. It's really not part of the budget, but it shows up in a fund to say this is the total cost of fleet services, and then they're charging each of the agencies for the use.
So they basically pass that cost on to the agency.
They do, yeah.
They're made whole.
That's right.
Understood. And then the only thing I'll say is, I think when we talked about 83, I thought that it's about, we expect about a $20 million revenue from it, and these numbers are just projections at this point. You know,
They're
who knows
really rough
how
estimates.
activity will change.
Well,
That $14 million, the delta between the 34 and the 20, that $14 million, is that expected? Is there any internal cost in that, or is that all to the vendor?
There is some internal costs in there. So there's personnel in DOT and police that are required to oversee the program and to check the tickets before they go out.
Probably wouldn't know off the top of your head what you expect out of that 14 million is internal cost. Would you?
It's about 3 million. I can get you the specific, but it's somewhere between 2 to 3 million is the internal, and the rest is the vendor cost. And the vendor cost was based on, I mean, DOT
The
code.
existing contract, we, in this body, we've had more than enough discussion on that.
Yeah. So we went by, this is what it's going to cost. So
That's it for me. I think the mayor had some comments or questions.
Well, actually, I just had one to Director Cinemay's point about public works and core services and the budget being there, just to remind folks that we're hiring, especially in public works. So if you want to help us get services back up in the right direction, please go to publicworks.baltimorecity.gov and apply for a job.
And that's the retention issue that we just talked about, those types of employees and us losing them and not being able to stay up. I think Comptroller has one additional question, or as many as you want, Comptroller.
That number, once again, is 410-396-3100. Actually, I had a follow-up to the council president, because I feel like we had a similar conversation about why the pension money wasn't lumped anymore. Right, yeah. But what right now, that money, when you look for it in the budget and the agency detail, it's part of the OPCs.
That's
right.
It's object to benefits in the
But
agency.
that what's in there is both the lump sum contribution that the city makes to the retirement system, which is a fixed cost and gets made no matter, you could in theory zero out all the existing police officers and you'd still owe this much to the retirement systems to cover our liability, our pension responsibilities. So it feels like it should still be worthwhile, in the interest of, being fair about how you're describing stuff, to separate that in the budget so that there's a different line for how much we're paying as a lump to the retirement system, as opposed to the variable cost of, supporting current officers that would go up or down depending on how many actual salaried and benefited positions we're funding in that budget. Fair?
Yeah, there is, when we get the reports from the pension systems, they do break it out that way. We budget the total lump cost and we allocate it on a per position basis for simplicity.
But if it's about sharing with the public the difference between our fixed costs that we can't do anything about
Right.
and the costs that are, at the discretion each year, in as much as we have our own discretion when it comes to the police department budget. Is that something, I mean, that shouldn't be difficult to just break that out and have that as a separate line.
Yeah, we could do that.
Okay, all right. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Mann?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to share a little bit of news. It may be known now to everyone, but I am announcing that we are postponing the city's tax sale. This will allow residents to take advantage of the resources and assistance available to pay off their liens and resolve outstanding obligation. And I've also directed Director Raymond and Finance Department to remove the approximately 2,900 properties that are homeowner properties from the tax sale. This is about making sure that we're protecting our homeowners and our legacy homeowners, and we look forward to continue to work with our partners on the council, the comptroller, and the city's tax sale work group as we look for more sustainable solutions to this issue that has been around for quite some time. Thank you.
We're good, City Solicitor, Director, we're good. Thank you so much, Mr. Senemy. Thank you so much, Director Raymond, for always coming out and briefing the Board of Estimates. Tonight, to folks that are tuning in, please tune in at 6 p.m. For Taxpayers Night. You're going to hear much of the same information that Bob presented, but it's an opportunity for taxpayers, for the citizens of Baltimore to come out and share their concerns, their support, their issues associated with this preliminary budget to the Board of Estimates. With that, we love you, Baltimore. See you at 6 p.m. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna do it here. Okay.